Welcome to episode 2 of the Beginner Woodwork series. Today we're going to discuss materials and consumables. Obviously, wood is going to be the main material that you use because we're doing woodworking. So let's discuss the options available. So there are absolutely thousands of wood types, but here are some of my favourite woods to use. When you first start out, you'll probably be working with something like pine. This is a bit of CLS timber. So this is 63mm by 38mm. These are very cheap and come in big lengths, like 2 metre lengths. So they're really cheap and really useful. You could also buy pine square stock, which is quite good as well. But whilst pine is nice, it's not the best material to work with in the world. It is a softwood, it dents easily, but then it is very easy to cut and work with. There's some other types of wood. So you've got balsa wood, which is used if you're making like planes or things like that. So that's a very light wood. It's actually, believe it or not, a soft hardwood. So it's very soft, so you would expect it to be a softwood, but it's actually a hardwood, believe it or not. Ash is a brilliant wood to start woodworking with. Here's a couple of bits of ash. So this is a square stock bit that I use when I'm doing wood turning. But for beginner woodworking, you can get something like this, which is a piece of ash. And it's really easy to work. It sands really well and it accepts the finish really well as well. So I'd recommend ash as one of the woods to use. Another one of my favourite woods to use is sapele. It's got a nice colour to it and it's a cheaper version of mahogany essentially, because this is a piece of mahogany and they're fairly similar in colour as you can see, but the sapele finishes really well. So for example, this play button was made with a sapele and ash bit of wood. So this was a bit of ash veneer and then I used sapele to make the actual play button with. And as you can see, it looks really nice when it's finished. Sapele is incredibly cheap for a hardwood, so I'd recommend that. Mahogany is really nice, but it's a lot more expensive, and I would say hold off getting any sort of thing like mahogany until you're experienced enough to know how to use it, because you don't want to waste it. Again, you've got something called a Roko here. I don't particularly like working with this wood. I wanted to have a go with it, and I saw it, so I picked up some of it, but it doesn't turn very nice, and it also doesn't cut particularly well. So I would hold off that unless you really know how to use it. A wood that I never really knew about is wild mango, but I quite like using that, although again I would steer clear of that for a beginner. Walnut's quite a nice wood to use. It is expensive, but it cuts really well, sands really well, and finishes beautifully. So if you've got a bit of a challenge that you want to do, have a go with some walnut. You can get small offcuts, which won't cost you too much. Of course, there's pallet wood, which is what a lot of woodworkers use. It's very hard to work with because it often has nail holes and bits of dents and stuff that you've got to fix, but once you've done all that, it's actually quite a nice wood to work with, and you can make it very rustic, obviously. Hard maple's quite a nice wood as well. This is just a bit of an offcut, but I like working with hard maple. And then we're going to move on to some man-made boards. So we've got OSB. I like OSB, obviously this workbench is made from OSB. Not the best material to use for a workbench, but I quite like using it when I'm filming. OSB is fairly cheap as it is, but it's very fashionable at the moment, so you could use that if you're doing something industrial, say like making a coffee table or something and you want an industrial look to it, you could use OSB. Then you've got plywood. This is a very big piece of plywood, laminated 3 bits of plywood together. I like plywood, but I actually prefer OSB. Plywood's fairly easy to work with and it's pretty cheap for what it is. There's also MDF. I don't have any small scraps of MDF, but I can show you what some MDF looks like as well. So here's a bit of MDF. As you can see, it's a fairly hard bit of wood. It's cheap, it's a man-made board. Perfect if you want to make something big, but it's also very, very hazardous to work with. That's why I tend to steer fairly clear of using MDF on anything. This is one of my favourite woods. This is Padauk. This is a very expensive wood, so unless you're doing something really fancy, I wouldn't necessarily advise using Padauk. Here's a bit of oak. Oak's a really good wood to work with. It's not particularly expensive. It can be hard to cut, but I like working with oak, and it also finishes really nicely and sands well. Last, we've got these two. This is a piece of American cherry. I really like American cherry. Again, finishes really well and has a nice orangey colour to it. It's also fairly cheap as a hardwood goes as well. Poplar, again, fairly cheap hardwood. Good for beginners because it almost cuts like a softwood. It's a very soft hardwood, and I find poplar very easy to work with and is one of my favourite woods. If I had to pick my 4 favourite woods, it would be poplar, sapele, probably ash, and maybe walnut in terms of real woods rather than man-made boards. I was thinking about putting pine in here, but pine can be quite hard to work with, so they would be my 4 favourite woods to work with. But there is thousands of wood types, as I've said, so just use whatever you feel like using. But as a beginner, sapele's a nice hardwood, poplar's a really nice hardwood, ash is really nice, walnut's nice as well, it's just a bit more expensive. Pine, obviously, good wood to use as well. And then obviously you've got your man-made boards, you've got your plywood, your OSB, and of course your MDF. So that's the material side of woodworking sorted. Now let's move on to having a look at some things like glues, finishes, paints, etc. Now we're going to have a look at some finishes and glue. So we'll start with the glue and get this out of the way. So this is Gorilla Wood Glue. This is my favourite brand of glue, but obviously there's Type Bonds, you can get own brand glues. But for me, Gorilla Glue is really strong, and for the toughest jobs on planet Earth, it really is a tough glue and is very, very good to work with. I've got this big box 1 litre of glue. This has lasted me probably a year now, and I've got about a third left, something like that, a quarter, a third left. I really like Gorilla Glue, and I'd recommend that for a beginner. It is quite expensive, but then again, it lasts so long, it pays for itself fairly quickly. Now let's have a look at some finishes. So Danish oil, you'll hear woodworkers talk about a lot. I would say Danish oil is probably the most versatile finish to use on wood. It's fairly cheap in terms of oil and stuff like that. I use this brand of Danish oil, it doesn't really matter, this is just what I have. I used this on my palette wood planters, and I'll link a video up there somewhere if you want to have a look at that. But this is just a fairly bog standard Danish oil. It's really nice, not too expensive. I mean, all finishes will be quite expensive. They'll be one of the more expensive aspects of woodworking, obviously, apart from tools. But I like this brand of Danish oil. Doesn't really matter what you use, though. Then, one of my favourite oils, Food Safe Finish. I really, really like this Food Safe Finish from Chestnut Products. This is my favourite finish to use out of all of them I own, because I do a lot of wood turning, and when I do woodworking as well, I really like Food Safe Finish because, obviously, it's suitable for food, and it also has a really nice colour similar to Danish oil. It's actually not too expensive. I would say this is slightly cheaper than Danish oil, but it's also just really easy to use. Really, really easy to use. You just wipe it on. Same with Danish oil. Then you've got acrylic satin lacquer. This is slightly more difficult to use because obviously it's got a spray can. So when you're spraying, you need to make sure you get even coverage. And these are not too expensive. I think this can's about £8 or £9. You can get gloss lacquer, but I preferred the satin lacquer, which I used on the Union Jack. Again, I'll put a link up there somewhere if you want to have a look at that video. This is again another Chestnut Products finish. I quite like using satin lacquer, although, as I've said, I use Food Safe Finish most, and then Danish oil after that. So there's some options for finish. Obviously, there's loads of other things you can use: shellac, mineral spirit, mineral oils, all those things. But to be honest, when you start out, Danish oil, a Food Safe Finish, and maybe a lacquer would be plenty. Someone asked me if I'd also talk a bit about stains and oils and a couple of dyes as well. So once you've started with the basics, you may want to expand your collection of dyes and things like that, because these are a really easy way to enhance your woodworking projects and just give them a really nice edge to them. So I've got this red Libron concentrated water-based dye. I've got a blue one and also have a yellow one. So if I just take the lid off one of them, as you can see, they've got a really nice, strong, vibrant colour to them. And you just dilute these with water, and I'll show you what I do to keep hold of them. I can guarantee you'll make too much dye a lot, so this is how I keep hold of them. I use these old spice jars, and then if I make too much, I simply unscrew the lid to this, pour it in, and then I just use this on the next project rather than making up a whole new batch. That way you don't waste them, as they're quite expensive. But they range from about £4 to £8 depending on what brand you buy and the size, but I like these ones. I've never used any other brand, but these seem to do a really, really good job. I used these on the Union Jack. I've used them for a couple of projects in terms of wood turning. I used them on my Shoshugibon bowl, which again, if you want to see how I did that, I'll link that at the top. But I recommend these. They're really easy to use, and they give your woodworking projects a really nice edge. They would look really good on something like pine if you did a Shoshugibon finish or something like that. So yeah, have a go with some dies. You got nothing to lose at the end of the day. If you mess it up, you can simply sand it off and try again. So last but not least, another way to simply enhance your woodworking projects is just to paint them. I tend to not paint a lot of my woodworking projects just because I like the look of the wood grain, and using a dye, you still get the wood grain come through, but you also get the colour. But if you're doing something like, I don't know, making a table or something, I don't know, a craft table, and you wanted to paint that, then you could use paints and just apply these rather than using a dye. Because paints are fairly cheap compared to dye, so they're a good way to go if you just want to do a simple project. I use Dulux, but it doesn't really matter. They all do the same thing, it just depends on the brand. Also, I know it's hard to get gloves at the moment, but usually I'd recommend using gloves when you're using dye or paint or glue. See, I use these when I made my MDF and stuff, that's why they've got all this sawdust and glue. I had a go at making MDF, didn't quite work, but I'll try again at some stage. But yeah, I would recommend getting at least a pair of gloves if you can get hold of any, because especially with the dyes, they can stay on your fingers for a day or two, which isn't the end of the world, it's just a bit annoying. In terms of other consumables, sandpaper's probably the biggest consumable. I have these sanding belts, and I actually ordered the wrong size, but a mistake's actually turned into a really, really useful thing, because I ordered the wrong size. As I said, they're too wide for my belt sander, but actually, rather than returning them, I just decided why not cut them up and use them as strips of sandpaper. And because they've got this really good backing on them, they're really thick, so I use this when I'm wood turning and if I'm doing something where a lot of splintery stuff's going to come off, because it stops it getting into your hands. So actually these are quite useful. I also use these as well when I'm wood turning, but you can use these for woodworking as well. Otherwise you can just go down the bog standard route of buying A4 sheets of sandpaper. Something like this, for example. This is the other sandpaper I use, made by Rocket. Doesn't really matter, it's just sandpaper. I would say with sandpaper though, make sure you do get a better quality one. Don't get a cheap one, because at the end of the day, the worse quality sandpaper you get, the longer it's going to take. I don't tend to do a lot of hand sanding, but it's handy to have some bits of hand sandpaper. And if you have an electric sander, obviously you're going to need electric sanding sheets. Screws, you'll use tons of screws when you're woodworking. They pretty much used in every project. I use dial, as I've discussed before, but again with screws, go with a brand you like and stick with them, because then you can just build up a collection. I have this old container that I use. I just cut out the labels, stuck on there, and then a really handy tip, keep the size of the screw and the type of screwdriver bit you'll need with them, so that way you know exactly what you're going to need. And I find having these is really handy, because rather than having to get out calipers and measure it, I can literally pull out a piece of cardboard and go, okay, I need a Posi 2 drive and it's a 30mm screw. Much easier than measuring them. So yeah, I use these screws, but there's so many you can get, to be honest. I just stick with this brand because I like them. In terms of other consumables, masking tape's really handy to have, just because, as I've discussed before, if you want to just rip off a bit, he says, so yeah, you can just rip off a bit of masking tape, stick it down onto your surface, and then you can scribble all over that rather than masking your surface. Double-sided tape's also quite useful. So say for example I wanted to sand this, imagine this is a piece of wood, I could put some double-sided sticky tape on the back and then sand without it moving all over the place. And then obviously afterwards you can come back and either chisel off the double-sided tape if you're really confident, or you can just sand it off, file it off, or just try and pick it off. Doesn't really matter. Last but not least, a necessity when you're woodworking is a first aid kit. I have this tiny one which sits on my windowsill, just in case I need one. This is basically just for plasters really, as you can see. And then this one is my full first aid kit, which has literally everything you need. So cold packs, scissors, bandages, heat blankets, everything in there. Don't skimp out on a first aid kit, because at the end of the day, it's your life, you want to protect it. I have this one, it's a first aid for sport one. This has everything I need and is a really, really good first aid kit. Hopefully I'll never have to use it, but I'd rather have it. Again, with a first aid kit, you also want to make sure you have a fire extinguisher. I keep this one right by the door. This is a 1 kilogram powder fire extinguisher. Definitely make sure you have a fire extinguisher, really important to have. Obviously you can also get a fire blanket and other fire protective measures, but at the bare minimum, a fire extinguisher, first aid kit, and protection for your lungs and eyes. Hope this has helped you with woodworking, and I hope you've learned a couple of things from this. Thanks for watching, and please share this video around to help other woodworkers.